we solve for the velocity by Pythagorean theorem. Vx muna, we have 1.3 meters per second square plus Vy naman, negative 4.91 meters per second square, quantity square. V natin is equal to from the previous lecture video, we studied the straight linear motion in horizontal and vertical directions, and we call it as the kinematics in one dimension. And now, motion in two dimensions is a combination of one-dimensional motion in the x and y directions. And from all those concepts, we will apply the independence of the horizontal and the vertical motions to projectile. So ano ba yung tinatawag natin na projectile? Projectile is an object that is thrown, kicked, batted, or launched into motion and then allowed to follow a path determined solely by the influence of the gravity, as we can see in this photo. In projectile motion, as we study this special situation of kinematics, meron tayong mga following assumptions. Number 1, no air resistance. Number 2, the acceleration due to gravity is constant downward and is equal to 9.81 meters per second square. And pangatlo, we ignore the Earth's rotation. For the air resistance can be significant if yung projectile natin ay gumagalaw with relatively high speed or kung makaka-encounter tayo ng strong wind or ng malakas na hangin. And in many situations, however, like magtotoss tayo ng ball to some location or magdadrop tayo ng book, yung air resistance is relatively insignificant. Kaya hindi na natin siya isasama for this situation of kinematics, the projectile motion. And as for the acceleration due to gravity naman, yung 9.81 meters per second square, etong value na to ay nagbabago slightly from place to place on the Earth's surface and pwedeng bumaba with increasing altitude. And in addition, yung rotation naman ng Earth can be significant kapag kino-consider na natin yung projectile na nagko-cover ng great distances. And so far, in this lecture video, sa mga susunod natin itatakan na example, we will have sample problems na maliliit na distances lang. So, speaking of errors, magkakaroon lang tayo ng maliit na error lang in ignoring the variation of the gravity or the rotation of the Earth. For the equations of motion in projectiles, i-incorporate na natin ngayon yung preceding assumptions na nabanggit natin kanina into the equations na gagamitin natin in projectiles. In these figures here, suppose that yung x-axis is horizontal and the y-axis is vertical with the positive direction upward. Ibig sabihin nun, downward is the negative direction. Noting that yung downward is the negative direction, it follows that yung acceleration due to vertical natin is negative 9.81 meters per second square, or simply, we have a negative acceleration due to gravity. Considering again, yung positive direction natin, yun yung upward. Magiging opposite siya dun sa natural direction ng acceleration due to gravity. That's why again, we will have a negative gravity here. In the x direction naman of the motion, walang effect ng gravity. It causes no acceleration. Therefore, the horizontal component of acceleration is 0. We have acceleration in the horizontal direction equals 0. And with this acceleration components, isa-substitute natin ito and ito dun sa fundamental constant acceleration equations of motion natin na na-derive natin from the previous lecture video. And again, as the acceleration vertical natin is equal to negative gravity and the acceleration horizontal is 0, for the x component, these are our equations. We have v sub x equals v sub x sub o, and x minus x sub o is equal to v sub xo times t. For the y component naman, we have three equations. Vy is equal to v sub yo minus gt, or simply plus times the negative gravity times time. Another, y minus y sub o is equal to v sub yo times t minus 1/2 g times t square. Kaya naging minus 1/2 yan is simply yung negative gravity pa din. And we have v sub y square equals v sub y o square minus 2g delta y. Kung mapapansin natin sa y direction, lahat ng gravity is negative. And yun nga yung result na yung assumption natin with the positive direction upward ito. So lahat natin gagamitin sa projectile motion is negative gravity. And for the x component, wala tayong nakikita ng acceleration kasi we have a zero acceleration. We have a constant velocity in the x direction of the motion. There is one special case in projectile motion and we call it as the zero launch angle. This projectile situation is launched horizontally so that yung angle between the velocity and the horizontal is equal to 0. In this figure here, we have an example of projectile motion na merong angle yung velocity from the horizontal. So this is the horizontal and ito yung kanyang angle. This second figure naman, this is the projectile motion with zero launch angle. This is the horizontal and ito rin yung kanyang starting motion, yung initial velocity, and we have 0 as the angle of motion. Suppose you're walking with a speed, say, v sub o, and nag-release ka ng ball from a height. This is the height. If we choose the ground level to be y as 0 and yung release point to be directly above the origin, ibig sabihin nun, the initial position of the ball is given by x sub o equals 0. Example number 1, a person skateboarding with a constant speed of 1.3 meters per second releases a ball from a height of 1.25 meters above the ground. Letter A, given that the x sub o is equal to 0 and y sub o is equal to h equals 1.25 meters, find the x and y for the time 0.25 seconds and the time 0.5 seconds. And letter B, find the velocity, speed, and direction of motion of the ball at 0.5 seconds. Nag-start yung ball at this point with considering the x sub o is equal to 0 and yung y sub o natin is equal to the height na 1.25 meters. Ito. The initial velocity is horizontal. So this is a main example of the projectile motion with zero launch angle. Therefore, yung v sub o x natin is equal to v sub o na lang. And this is 1.3 meters per second. And yung v sub oy naman natin, since we are in kinematics in 2 dimensions, kaya lang yung starting motion niya, we have a zero launch angle here and yung kanyang velocity is directly nakalatag dun sa horizontal. Ibig sabihin, yung velocity natin at y, initial velocity at y, or in the vertical component is 0. In addition, nag-accelerate yung bola with the acceleration due to gravity in the negative y direction. So, i-apply natin yung concept na the acceleration vertical is equal to negative acceleration due to gravity. Nasa negative y direction. And gumagalaw yung bola with the constant speed in the x direction. Kapag meron tayong constant speed, doon sa x direction niya, hindi nagbabago yung kanyang speed. Constant, and kapag walang pagbabago yung speed or walang change in speed or change in velocity, walang magaganap na acceleration in the x direction. That's why again, ax is equal to 0, kagaya ng nabanggit natin kanina. For letter A, we can solve the x and y positions using these equations. X is equal to v sub o times time, and yung y naman is equal to height minus 1/2 g times t square respectively. And simply, substitute na lang natin yung time into these expressions. And similarly, sa velocity components naman are vx, or simply vo lang siya, ito. And yung vy is equal to negative gt. So for letter A, we substitute the values. X muna tayo. For the x position, ang v sub o natin is 1.3 meters per second. Times the time na 0.25 seconds muna. So we cancel seconds. X is equal to 0.325 meters. For the y position naman, we have 1.25 meters. Ito yung height. Minus 1/2 times the gravity, 9.81 meters per second square. Or simply, dinirect na natin ng minus siya kasi this is plus times negative gravity lang din. Kagaya nung itong concept natin in projectile motion. Times the time na 0.25 muna tayo, quantity square, y is equal to 0.943 meters. This is the x and y positions for the time na 0.25 seconds. For 0.5 seconds naman, same process ang gagawin natin. Babaguhin lang natin yung time. X is equal to 1.3 meters per second times time na 0.5 seconds. And by calculating, x is equal to 0.65 meters. For the y position, with the time again na 0.5 seconds, 1.25 meters minus 1/2 times 9.81 meters per second square times time na 0.5 seconds quantity square, and by calculating again, y position is equal to 0.0238 meters. After 0.25 seconds, ito na yung position niya from the origin dito sa origin na to. Ito na yung line niya, and ang taas niya is 0.943 meters. Whereas, after 0.5 seconds naman, ito niya yung kanyang position in x direction, and ito yung sa y direction. For letter B naman, we are asked to find the velocity, speed, and direction of motion of the ball at time 0.5 seconds. When we are talking about the velocity of the motion of the ball, ibig sabihin, ang inaanap sa atin is yung resultant velocity. Alam na natin yung Vx, which is V sub O lang din, and we have 1.3 meters per second for V sub x. For Vy, this letter B, for Vy naman, we have negative gravity times the time. At dito natin makukuha yung velocity in y direction. So, ang gravity natin is 9.81 meters per second square times the time na 0.5 seconds. Letter B na tayo. Ito yung time na given. V sub y is equal to negative 4.91 meters per second. And to solve for the velocity, alam na natin yung components, which is yung Vx, 1.3 meters per second, and yung Vy, negative 4.91 meters per second. We solve for the velocity by Pythagorean theorem. We have Vx muna, we have 1.3 meters per second square plus Vy naman negative 4.91 meters per second square quantity square. V natin is equal to 5.08 meters per second. This is the velocity of the ball after 5 seconds. And the direction naman, angle theta, we use the tangent function, inverse tangent is equal to Vy over Vx. Angle theta is equal to inverse tangent. Ang Vy natin again is negative 4.91 meters per second. Over Vx, we have 1.3 meters per second. Angle theta is now equal to negative 75.2 degrees. Take note that yung x position ng bola doesn't depend on the acceleration of the gravity, yung g natin, and yung y position naman doesn't depend on the initial horizontal speed of the ball, yung v sub o natin. For example, if the person is running when he drops the ball, yung ball natin is gagalaw ng mas mabilis in the horizontal direction, and it keeps up with the person as it falls. Yung vertical motion doesn't change at all. So this is example number 1. Example number 2, a man encounters a space between two ice elevations. The elevation at the right ice is 2.74 meters lower and has a distance of 4.10 meters from the left ice. The climber gets a running start and jumps in the horizontal direction to cross the space. Letter A. What is the minimum speed needed by the climber to safely cross? And letter B, if the climber's speed is 6 meters per second, how far does the climber land? So in this problem, the man or the climber jumps from the initial position, say this is our initial position, as 0, and yung initial position natin at the vertical, which is yung height, we have the 2.74 meters na height. Doon siya nag-start, papunta dito sa lower elevation. For the letter A question, the landing site is 4.10 meters ang layo from the original position. And yung y naman dito is equal to 0 na. So this 2.74 meters here, ito yung ating original position for the vertical direction. As for the initial velocity, we are given that yung velocity natin, initial velocity at the x direction or v sub ox ay equal din dun sa initial velocity natin. Unang-una kasi wala naman tayong v sub oy, wala tayong initial velocity sa y direction. So this is 0. And finally, with our choice of the coordinates, it follows that masusunod pa rin natin dito yung principle na there is no acceleration x. And ang acceleration y natin is equal to negative acceleration due to gravity. So this is another example of projectile in zero launch angle. Wala ulit tayong angle dito. And we can apply our equations for projectile motion with a horizontal launch. For letter A, we can solve the velocity or the minimum speed with the equation x equals v sub o t. Since wala naman tayong initial velocity sa y direction. Kaya lang, ang problem natin is yung time. So we have to solve first for time and then substitute natin in this equation to solve for the minimum speed needed by the man or the climber to safely cross. And to solve for time, ang gagamitin naman natin is yung y direction. We have y equals height minus 1/2 g times t square. Whereas yung y natin is equal to 0. So this is 0 equals height. Yung height natin is yung initial position at y direction minus 1/2 gt square. Solving for time, lipat natin sa kabila, we have 1/2 gt square, positive na yan, equals the height. And we cross multiply, so yung 2 doon mapupunta sa kabila, gt square equals 2h. And dividing both sides by g, cancel. And the time is equal to the square root of 2h over g. X equals v sub o, and we have the equation for time, square root of 2 times height over the gravity. We are solving for the minimum speed or yung velocity natin. So we derive again the equation to solve for the v sub o. To solve for the v sub o or the minimum speed, we simply just cross multiply na lang. This is x equals v sub o, and this is square root of 2h over the square root of g. Cross multiply, we have now x times the square root of the gravity over the square root of 2h equals v sub o. Solving for v sub o, ang x natin is equal to 4.1 meters times the square root of the gravity na 9.81 meters per second square over 2 times ang height natin is 2.74 meters. Finally, by calculating, v sub o is equal to 5.49 meters per second. So this is the minimum speed needed by the climber para ma-cross niya ng safe yung horizontal distance sa 4.10 meters at yung taas na 2.74 meters. Ito yung kailangan niyang speed to create that projectile motion. For the letter B, we can directly use this equation since ang hinahanap natin is kung gaano kalayo yung maabot ng climber kapag meron siyang speed, eto yung speed na yan, na 6 meters per second. So for letter B, we use the same equation, x is equal to v sub o times the square root of 2h over the gravity. Hindi na natin i-arrange kasi ang hinahanap na mismo sa atin is yung distance, kung gaano kalayong maabot nung man or ng climber with the speed of 6 meters per second. Substituting the values, x is equal to v sub o is 6 meters per second times the square root of 2 times, same height ang gagamitin natin kasi yun yung kanyang panggagalingan din. We have 2.74 meters over 9.81 meters per second square. And by calculating, x is equal to 4.48 meters. Ito yung layo na maabot niya from the starting position using the speed of 6 meters per second. So the minimum speed to safely cross the space in that two ice is 5.49 meters per second. Kung yung initial horizontal speed naman ay 6 meters per second, ang maaabot ng man or ng climber ay 4.48 meters from the starting position. So this is example number 2.